Good evening. This is the best in anomalous talk radio. You're tuned in to Midnight in the Desert. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. A few moments, we're going to be talking Bigfoot. Make sure you tune in tomorrow. Gregory Little spends the first 2 hours with us as we go in search of Atlantis. And then Nora Treskello will join us for the Science of Intuition. That's tomorrow on Midnight in the Desert. Right now, though, we're going to spend some time with Laura Krantz. She is a veteran public radio producer. She is here to share her journey into the world of Bigfoot and why this creature seems to ignite our imaginations. What this fascination comes from. I mean, it's crazy to me, Laura. And yourself, you're a journalist, editor, producer, both in radio and print. You're also the host and creator and producer of the new podcast, The Wild Thing. Bigfoot, this character seems to really fascinate people worldwide, and their interest just continues to grow when it comes to discussing this. It seems like it should be the easiest thing to dismiss, but it's not, even after all these years and no conclusive hands-on fur, scat, blood, body evidence. People still believe. Why do you think that is?
Oh man, there are a lot of reasons for that, I think. But I think one of the biggest ones is people really enjoy the mystery of that. People really like the idea that something like this could be out there in the world, that the world is still wild enough and still untamed enough that it could support a big, undocumented primate like Bigfoot. I mean, I know that's part of the appeal for me. And I think also it's this idea that, you know, if Bigfoot is real, it's probably related to us in some evolutionary fashion. And so you could see Bigfoot as like the road not taken. If we didn't have to put on pants every morning and pay taxes, maybe our life would be like Bigfoot, living out there in the woods.
I love your background. What a pedigree. And to have somebody on talking about this, let me get this right. Yeah, so you edited and produced for NPR in Washington as part of multiple shows, including Morning Edition and Weekend Edition. You've served as the lead editor for Take Two, a news magazine show from Southern California Public Radio in Los Angeles. You've written for various publications, including Popular Science, Smithsonian Magazine, Outside, Take Part, and Newsweek, as well as for NPR.org. I want people to know that, because when I talk about quote-unquote journalists, because of the advent of the internet and how easy it is to blog, many people call themselves journalists that are in fact not journalists. And I want people to know that who we're talking to tonight actually comes from a journalist pedigree, and that this is part of your real world and your backup. What got you into the research or the interest in Bigfoot and cryptids?
Yeah, so this started back in 2006. I was working for NPR at the time. I was living in Washington, D.C., and I happened to be flipping through the Washington Post one day, looking for interesting stories and just catching up on the news, and there was this big article in there about a guy named Grover Krantz, and all these crazy photos of bones and skeletons and some guy opening a drawer at the Smithsonian Institution, and of course, same last name, so I started reading the article. And, there's some interesting little tidbits in there about how this guy, Grover, had donated his body to the Tennessee Body Farm, which is this part of the University of Tennessee, and it does tissue decomp analysis. They basically do forensic analysis on bodies and how they decay, and then use the information for various crimes or missing persons, or when they find a body. And then his bones went to the Smithsonian and ended up being on display at the Smithsonian. And so already I'm thinking, wow, this guy's kind of an eccentric and a weirdo, but kind of an interesting guy. And then there's this sort of throwaway section at the end of the article that talks about how he'd been a tenured professor of anthropology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, and he was also the country's leading academic expert on Bigfoot. And at this point, I'm thinking, who is this guy? And are we related? Because same last name, he grew up in Salt Lake City, which is where my dad's family was from. So I emailed my dad, and my dad said, doesn't ring a bell with me. Let me ask your grandfather. And he said, yeah, that's my cousin. He used to show up at the family picnics and measure people's heads with calipers. And clearly a strange guy, fascinated by science, fascinated by anatomy and anthropology, has a tenured position as a professor there, And then he's really into Bigfoot. And I'm thinking, well, maybe there's more to this Bigfoot thing than I thought. And that's kind of the genesis of this whole story. This is how I kind of got onto this track.
All right. And, you know, to examine a story like this and remain, you know, objective,
Mm-hmm.
You know, that to me has always been an interesting facet, because I've talked to a lot of real journalists, not just online weekend bloggers, but real journalists. And I watch the excitement in their eyes when they start talking about UFOs and Bigfoot. And I say, well, where's your objectivity? And they're like, oh, I'm being completely objective, but this is so cool. Do you ever find yourself kind of having to reel yourself back in when you're examining these cases because of the woo-woo factor?
Well, there is that element for sure. And as I was doing this show, as I was doing Wild Thing and working on this series, I sort of made an attempt to stick with Grover's viewpoint on Bigfoot, which is that it's a flesh and blood creature. It's beholden to the same laws of physics and biology that the rest of us are. I didn't really get into the paranormal or supernatural side of things just because that wasn't what Grover had done. So I chose to follow in his footsteps, if you will. But there were certainly moments where I would hear stories from people, their personal eyewitness encounters or their experiences that they think might have been an encounter with Bigfoot. And those were really hard to dismiss, because a lot of the people that I heard these stories from were seasoned fish and game people. They were BLM, they were Forest Service, they were people who had spent years of their lives out in the woods, weren't easily startled, weren't surprised by the animals they were seeing out there. And then they had some sort of experience that really changed things for them. And hearing those stories were the kinds of things where I was like, maybe there is more to this. So, but then there would be times where people would tell me some story they had, or they'd show me some piece of supposed evidence, and I would just think, no way. So it was sort of this back and forth throughout the process of reporting this story. But I tried to remain as objective as I possibly could.
All right, going in, were you a firm skeptic, or were you an open-minded believer? You know,
I would put me more in the firm skeptic category, in that most of my exposure to Bigfoot had been either Harry and the Hendersons, a classic of its genre.
Of course, right?
Yeah, and then tabloid headlines. You know, you'd stand at the supermarket getting your groceries, and there would be the Weekly World News with Bat Boy and Bigfoot, and National Enquirer, I had Bigfoot's baby, all that kind of stuff. So that was really sort of my experience with Bigfoot and my exposure to it. And so I just always thought of it as kind of a joke, campfire tale, but I never really put much thought into it at all. And
how long have you been researching and looking into this now?
So this process really started about 1.5 years ago. I'd been living in DC, and then I'd moved, and that's where I learned about Grover, and then I moved to LA for work. And this story just kind of stayed tucked in the back of my mind for a long time. And then when I moved to Colorado, which is where I live now, I found out that Grover's fourth wife lived not very far from me, about 30 miles away. And that I took that as a sign. I was like, you know what? Maybe I need to do something with this story. But let's start by going to talk to his widow, Diane, and just get to know a little bit more about him and see if this is something I really want to pursue. And yeah, that was I guess May of 2000. What year is it? It was May of 2017.
What year is it? Oh my gosh! And I thought I'm disconnected from time to time. All right, so you have that. You go speak with her. What is that like? Is it a paradigm shifter for you?
No, not particularly, but what it did was it made me more intrigued in Grover. And so I wanted to find out more about him and find out why this guy, who was such a serious anthropologist and was someone who actually was making fairly important findings in the field of anthropology, was willing to put that on the line and put his reputation on the line to go look into Bigfoot. Because it seemed a little crazy to me, honestly, to just sort of throw away your academic pedigree, your academic credentials, your respect in that particular community, and go after something that is seen as such a joke. And talking to Diane, she had some interesting stories about him. She put me in touch with more people. And that's sort of what this started as, is just like me calling a lot of people and me starting to talk to them about their experiences, about what they knew about Grover, about their thoughts about Bigfoot, and going from there. I'm not sure if I ever had a complete paradigm shift. I will say that, I went from being a complete skeptic to probably more of an open-minded skeptic is where I would probably place myself on the spectrum at this point.
Fair enough. What did you find when you start looking into this man, and what would make somebody shift so dramatically? What surprised you most about his story?
I think for me, in terms of Grover, it was the fact that he had risked his career on this. And then there was all of the people who respected him so much and really liked him as a teacher and a colleague and a friend. And I think that probably because of the tabloid thing, I had this idea that people who were interested in Bigfoot were a little bit crazy, a little bit kooky, maybe not connected to reality. And so that was the first thing, I think, is this sort of made me rethink the kind of people who might be interested in Bigfoot and might be wanting to look into this a little bit more seriously. That was the first thing that really changed for me. And then, like I said, hearing some of these eyewitness encounters, hearing some of these stories from people who are very down to earth, science-oriented, wild, had spent a lot of time in the wilderness and out camping and hiking and in the backcountry. Hearing their stories was sort of changed my perspective. And the last thing that really kind of blew my mind was I was invited to come out to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, and there had been some very large nests that had been found, large ground nests, very similar to the kinds of nests that gorillas make in Africa. And no one could say for sure, hey, these are definitely Bigfoot nests, but they could definitively say this is something different. This is not something we've seen. This is not normal wildlife behavior. And seeing those was another one of those moments where I just kind of thought, maybe. I'm intrigued by the people that have seen it, that are very familiar with the outdoors, that are in these elements. Like you throw me out there, and I don't know what it would look like to run into a bear, or a bear with mange, or a wildcat, or, how would I maybe mistake that? But when you start running into people who are very familiar, grew up in these environments, and stand by these stories, as you said, you became a more open-minded skeptic talking to people like that. Were there stories that when they were telling you, there were tells, like a tip off to you that you believe that what they're saying is very real to them, as opposed to maybe embellishing a story to get attention? Yeah, my feeling is there wasn't actually a lot of embellishment with these stories. It's not like it's a fisherman telling a story where he's like, I went out and I caught this huge marlin, and it turns out it's like an 8-inch trout. Like, there's not that level of exaggeration. There's They're very keen on getting the details right and remembering every single detail as though they were reliving it. They're not telling, and in fact, the stories aren't even that masterfully told. A lot of times you're kind of like, get to the point, like, hurry up, let's get to the good stuff. And they're sort of just deliberately walking through step by step. This is where I was. This was happening that day. This is what the weather was like. It's this sort of attention to detail, as opposed to telling a story in a masterful way that kind of makes me feel as though that adds some veracity to it. The other thing is most of these people are not grandstanders. They're not the kind of people who are standing up at the front of a crowd and waving their arms and saying, pay attention to me. That wasn't the vibe I got off of a lot of them. So they're not looking for fame. They're not looking for fortune. I think a lot of them recognize that by telling this story, they're opening themselves up to a little bit of ridicule and criticism and people snickering behind their backs. So, that's kind of a risk to take, just for the sake of having a story to tell.
Were there any that, as they were telling you, I mean, you get that sense. I've talked to so many people over 13 years that have had experiences that there are some of these people you can watch their eyes kind of glaze over, and it raises the hair on the back of my neck, my arms. I just know that where they're at, they're seeing it again. Does that happen for you often when you hear these stories?
There were a couple where I was just like, man, that would have scared the bejesus out of me. Like it just... they tell the story and they tell it in a way, like I said, that it's not particularly like spellbinding or masterfully told. And often we were just sort of sitting in a parking lot somewhere, or it wasn't even like a spooky environment where I was hearing the story. But you just kind of hear it. It gives you the creeps. I got that feeling with a couple of those stories.
What stood out about them specifically? I mean, do you remember a story or two that you could share with us?
Oh, sure. There was a story from a guy named John Mayanzinski who lives in Wyoming, and this was back in the 70s when he had his experience. But he was doing some work for Fish and Wildlife, either Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife, and he had gotten his gear out of the depot. And as he was leaving, some guy said to him, "Hey, I spilled bacon grease on that tent. Be careful." Which it's kind of the last thing you want to hear is you're headed out into bear country, but you got to go. So he gets out there.
That would be the top of the list of bad things to hear.
Right.
Okay.
So he sets up his tent and he turns in for the night, and he falls asleep, and then he wakes up to hear the sound of this breathing not far from his tent. And his first assumption is bear, because of course you have the bacon grease, like it's probably, and you're in bear country, it's probably going to be a bear. And sure enough, whatever it is comes over to the tent and presses its face, nose, whatever, into the bacon grease stain. And so John whacks it with his hand and lets out a yelp, and this thing like runs away behind the trees. And then it comes back and does the same thing a second time, and John repeats that. And then it comes back a third time, and this time he thinks it looks like the bear is standing over his tent. There's a full moon that night, so he can see a lot of the stuff being silhouetted onto the surface of the tent. And it looks like something standing up over the tent. He thinks it's a bear holding on to the branch of the lodgepole pine that's above his tent. And then he sees a face or something poke in again at that bacon grease stain. And then he's thinking, shoot, this is a mother bear and its cub, which is the second worst thing after bacon grease stain that you probably want to hear when you're out in bear country.
Right.
So he wants to drive him away, so he yells again and whacks the thing that's poking into the side of the tent. And this time it is not soft like the previous times, like he was hitting a nose. This time it's quite hard. And whatever is above his tent kind of seems to lose its balance and fall over, and it comes down on the tent. John scrambles out and is trying to see what's going on. This thing takes off and hides behind the trees again, and then John goes and sits by the remains of his fire and kind of stokes it back up again. And he can still hear it breathing off there in the distance, and he still has no idea what this thing is. The thought of Bigfoot, at least this is what he tells me, is that the Bigfoot had never even entered his mind. He was just thinking, he was trying to figure out what it was, but he didn't even think Bigfoot. And then after a little bit of time, he starts seeing these pine cones being thrown at him, kind of lobbed in his direction. And so now he's thinking, this is the weirdest bear I've ever encountered, because bears don't throw pine cones.
Right.
And, he kind of just stays hunkered down. And then dawn comes and this thing is gone, and he goes out and looks for tracks and can't find any because the pine duff is too thick. So he goes back to the base and talks to his boss, and his boss says, well, that might have been a Bigfoot encounter, because we've had similar reports from other people in that area. And
so just kind of matter of fact throws it, maybe that's a Bigfoot encounter.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Which is wild. That's not the first thing I think my boss would say if I were to come back with that story. But
no.
Then again, I think that there's a lot of interesting tales and interesting encounters that come out of these areas that are less populated and less well known. So anyway, this story really stuck with John, and it kind of he continued to do different work with the different game services, but he has kept this Bigfoot stuff in the back of his mind for a long time and keeps an eye out.
And you hear a story like that, and how does that then impact you, that it's not just one guy, but that even his company is like, oh yeah, that's probably Bigfoot. I mean, as an investigative reporter or journalist, then does that kick your juices going to maybe go out and put yourself in that environment and see if you too can have that encounter?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, this was in the 70s, so it would have been a little tougher to replicate that now 30 some odd years later, but it certainly
bacon still smells good.
Yeah, bacon does still smell good. There might be more bears now though than there were in the 70s.
Yeah.
But it definitely gets you thinking about the type of people who are out looking for Bigfoot and thinking about this and who have had these kinds of experiences, and realizing that it's not just those who are kind of living in a altered reality.
Right. Okay. And now again, researching this, putting it out there, have you gone out to personally invest yourself in a well-known hotspot for these creatures to see if you can find evidence or have an encounter yourself?
So, and this is coming up in the next episode of the podcast, which will be out next week. And I went out with a group of 4 people who'd had some experience doing Sasquatch hunting and Sasquatch expeditions and being out in the backcountry. And we went to an area in the Mount Hood National Forest and spent a weekend out there in an area where a guy had an encounter a couple years prior to that. And we set up our tents in the same spot, and they did some wood knocks, they did some calls. We went out on a night hike and tried to recreate sort of a similar experience to what he'd had before. It was definitely interesting to hear his story and be out there. In some ways it is creepier to be in the middle of the woods and hear those kinds of stories.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll get into your head for sure. Objectivity is out the window at that point, and human nature steps in.
Yeah, you're kind of like, who can I put in front of me if this thing attacks? Like, who will I feed to it?
Now you know I have 11 children. If I can't outrun whatever it is that's chasing me, I've got kids to trip. I've got my way out of the park every time.
Exactly. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. And I did try to go out on a longer expedition, but the timing didn't end up working out. But I tried to get out into the woods several different times and sort of see different areas where people had been. There were some limitations on this project from the standpoint that, limited time and limited budget. But, I talked to a lot of people and tried to get out into a number of different spots around the Pacific Northwest specifically.
All right. I know you've got it coming up in the next episode, but can you tease us a little bit on that? Anything that might interest listeners to find out that you had an experience?
I wish I could say I had an experience. We had some moments where we thought something might be going on, but the people I went with are also what you might call open-minded skeptics, or that maybe they're a little bit less skeptical, especially the guy who'd had his own experience. But they are of the school that if you don't see Bigfoot making the noise, you can't say it's Bigfoot, or you kind of have to rule out every other possibility before you can say that it is in fact Bigfoot. They've based entire series and documentaries on the complete opposite of that, Laura. I know. They have.
Yet they continue to show, right?
Yes, and that gets to the heart of sort of this whole podcast was like, what is it about Bigfoot that is so appealing to people? And we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but I think people like the idea that something like this could be out there, that they could you could still find something like this, and wouldn't that be a fascinating discovery? And then that opens the doors for what else are we missing? What else is science not necessarily up to date on? They find species pretty often, And granted, they're smaller species, but for instance, there's a tree kangaroo in Papua New Guinea that they thought was extinct for a century. And then an amateur botanist happened to be in the area, and he was looking around at stuff, and he climbed a little higher into the trees than people normally do. And then all of a sudden, there we are. He sees a tree kangaroo.
We'll hear more about that. Laura Krantz, our guest. And what happens when you put yourself into these situations and you find yourself in the middle of the woods where experiences have been told? And what if you come face to face? What's the plan then, Laura Krantz? We'll find out when we return. I'm Dave Schrader. You're listening to Midnight in the Desert. Bigfoot. You've seen it from the safety of your home on television, featured in programs, documentaries, movies, podcasts, radio. But what if you decide to put yourself in the elements, to go into the woods and seek face-to-face connection with this beast? That's what our guest did on a few occasions. And I'm just curious, what was the game plan, Laura, if you get out there and it finds you or you find it? Did you bring a butterfly net? Did you bring some mace? What was the idea of what's next once you've confronted and seen this?
Well, I was going to lure it back to my car with some Pop-Tarts, just leave them out in a trail, and then hopefully it would get in, and I'd drive it back to civilization before it figured out what was going on.
This isn't James Woods. Candy. Candy.
Honestly, I had not gotten that far. I was sort of letting the people who were more of the experts dictate what the plan of action was going to be with that. So I guess you could say in this situation, the ignorance was bliss.
Yeah, that's one thing I could say.
I was more concerned about mountain lions and bears than I was about Bigfoot. I figured it's pretty rare if it exists. Right. So the odds were not going to be in my favor that I was going to actually encounter one. Now, that would have made for quite a story if I had, and it probably would have changed the entire podcast. I would have had to rip the whole thing up and start over from scratch. So I guess on one hand, I'm bummed that I didn't see one, and on the other hand, I'm grateful because that would have been a lot more work.
I'm always blown away by the fact that so many people want to go and have the experience, and then everybody asks, "Well, what's your plan?" And nobody ever really has a plan. Isn't that kind of funny? I mean, when you think about it, it's like, hey, you're about to go face a very large apex predator, right? I mean, this animal, if it's out there, is very good at adapting and surviving. Mm-hmm. And you're going to go face to face with maybe a 9 to 11 foot muscular, hairy, wild animal.
Yeah. One of the guys I was with said that he did have a plan, but he did not elaborate on the details. I think there is some concern about, in order for science to say, yes, Bigfoot is in fact real, they need a specimen, they need a body. Right. And for someone to come out and say, yeah, our plan is to shoot one, that may not be the thing you want to say in front of the journalists that you, A, don't know very well, and B, who might report that then back to the rest of the world. This is what happened to Grover, my relative. I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but he did an interview with a reporter back in the 90s, I believe, 80s or 90s, and he said, yeah, I want to shoot one. I want to have a specimen. And the reporter dutifully put that in the story, and the story was syndicated in newspapers around the country, and Grover got so much hate mail that he actually had to resort to a form letter to send out to people in response.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So he, it is one of those kind of things that in science you do need one to examine. And, that is going to be there have been claims of shooting a Bigfoot, numerous claims. But it's going to fall under a whole new realm of what have we done once this has happened? Is it that close of a human connection? Is it murder? Mm-hmm. Is it justifiable because you're out in the middle of the woods and it seemed like a wild animal? I don't know.
That's certainly one of the questions that's come up. Another guy raised the point, well, what if you shoot it and it's the last one? And, I don't know if that would necessarily be the case, but it certainly would be a rare species, and shooting one could do some damage to the population. So, yeah, there's a lot of ethical and moral considerations with something like that, but there's also, on the other side, the evidentiary. I guess the best thing to do is to maybe try and cut off a finger and take it in for DNA analysis.
Maybe just some toenails. Maybe that would be easier for you to do.
You could do a little pedicure, get them hold still long enough. You could cut the
Bugs Bunny cartoon with the big monster.
Yeah, exactly.
I've had people offer to bring me out, and that's been my one point. I'm like, okay, I want to do this. I want to go with you. What's our plan when we run into this?
And you haven't no one's told you what the plan
Nobody
is.
Tells me what the plan is. All of them will tell you, I'm a no-kill guy. We're going to go. And I'm like, okay, I respect that. I respect that you're a no-kill guy. But what are we going to do? Are we bringing some type of protection? Are we bringing animal mace? Are we bringing something so that we don't end up, rended limb from limb in the middle of the forest? What's the game plan? Nobody has one. It's astonishing to me. Otherwise, here's the deal. I like living, and I'm not a big fan of the out of doors. So when you have no plan to take me out there and get me back safely, it doesn't really intrigue me to make that trek. And I don't know, maybe I'm just being too much of a wuss, but that's I want to just know that we've got a real plan. And you're a little different than I am, I guess, in the fact that when somebody tells me, well, I got a plan, don't worry. I don't just go, okie dokie, he's got a plan. I'm a little bit more nervous, I guess, and mistrusting of the human race to just go out in the woods with somebody who's got a plan. But I give you kudos, because that's remarkable that you'll put yourself out there to see what this is. And as you said, it's not even just the bear, or I mean the Sasquatch. It's bear, it's mountain lions, it's, pileated woodpeckers, big owls, aliens. Who knows what else is waiting for me in the wilderness?
Other people.
Yes, there's that too. Yeah, and that can get kind of terrifying in itself. All right, so going through all these different kind of studies and talking to all the people that you've talked to, I guess, do you think personally that there is a flesh and blood creature still out there to be discovered in America?
You mean the flesh and blood creature, meaning Bigfoot?
Yeah. Do you think that there is still a creature that could be that size that could live amongst us without without being caught at this point? Yeah,
that's the hard thing for me, is in all of this, and in seeing evidence, and in talking to people. Like, I think that perhaps once upon a time the possibility was greater, but with all the game cameras that are out there, with all of the drone cameras, with all of everyone's got a cell phone with a camera in their pocket. There's just more and more people out in the wilderness now. I am seeing it as being harder and harder for something like this to exist and continue to exist secretly. So, and the lack of real physical evidence has, at least from what I've seen, has not made me think that it is definitely out there. I like to think that it would be, and if it's going to be anywhere, I think it's going to be the Pacific Northwest and up into Canada. But it just seems like as the years go by and we still don't have more evidence, and we still don't have a specimen, and we still don't have the kinds of things that would make this stand up in court, it gets harder to say absolutely 100% this thing is out there.
If you don't mind, we have about 15 minutes left together, and I know our listeners are fascinated by stories. If you would be willing to share a couple more of the encounters that people have shared with you that you found really compelling.
Yeah. So one of the stories came from a guy named Derek Randalls, who lives up who's up on the Olympic Peninsula as well. And he told a story of, probably in the 80s, I think is what he said. He was out hiking with his friends. They were out in the backcountry. They were off trail, and they'd gotten to the spot where they were going to set up camp for the night. And they just started setting up. And then all of a sudden, these rocks started coming in. And they were big, and they were coming pretty close, like not not hitting them, but awfully close, too close for comfort. And first they were coming into the right of where they were standing. And then they started coming into the left. So it's clear that this thing, whatever it was, whatever was throwing stuff at them, could see where they were and was trying to warn them. And they packed up their stuff, and because they could hear something coming through the brush, and they just took off down towards the trail. And at one point, Derek sort of got a hold of his senses, and he remembered, oh, I have a gun in my bag. I've got a pistol. And he turned around and pulled it out of his bag, and he was going to, defend himself with it, whatever was coming after him. And he said at that moment he saw whatever, this thing come out from the tree line, and it was huge. He said it was enormous, and it just sort of stood there on 2 feet looking at him. And he didn't know what to do. He just was completely flabbergasted by this. And this is, again, someone who'd spent most of his life and most of his, childhood and early adulthood out in the woods, exploring in the backcountry, never even gave Bigfoot a second thought. And then this completely changed his outlook on Bigfoot. It just blew his mind.
And see, then it's those stories that re-engage you, right? Because
exactly.
When it's, science tells you there's just no way.
Yeah. In
current day, this can be taking place. But then you hear these stories, and one after another, more compelling. And, for what it's worth, I've mentioned it on the show before and over the years of doing my own program. I had an experience when I was younger in Foley, Alabama. My grandparents owned 40 acres, and about 10 of it was livable. We used to hear large things thumping around out there all the time and never put any thought into what it was. I just always assumed it was wild animals. And my cousin and I were fishing at the pond one day, and we heard something loud walking through the woods. And at first, our dads would get up early and go hunting in the woods, and they'd be out there walking around, and we're listening, and it keeps through the woods, and it's coming towards the back of the pond. We're sitting on the opposite side, and there's big bushes and overgrowth on that other side. And all of a sudden, this hairy hand comes up over the top of this super tall bush and pushes it down. And I can see from the nose up this wild black-gray mane of hair and this dark inset face. And the hand was like Chewbacca's, because it had hair that came up over the tops of the fingers when it pushed down the branch or pushed down the top of the bush, and it stared at us. And it was one of those moments when your brain just kind of stops. And I looked at my cousin, and he looked at me, and we looked back at it. And I remember just physically trying to process. My brain was just like, what are we looking at here? And doing a quick database reference of that doesn't look like a bear, that doesn't look like a lion, that doesn't look like a tiger. I don't know what that thing is. And, granted, this was, 10 years or so after the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I'd seen it on shows like In Search Of and so on, but I just couldn't wrap my head around what this thing was that we were looking at. All I knew is it was unnerving, and we took off up the hill, half expecting it was one of our dads being a smart aleck and out there trying to spook us. Mm-hmm. And we got up to the house, and the entire family, everybody was up there. And we were so shaken. Our grandpa and my dad and my uncle all grabbed their shotguns and went out to check, because they didn't know if it was some wild man living out in the woods, and went to go examine it and make sure there's nobody out there. But they found nothing. But that sticks with me. I mean, I can see that face, 40 years later. And it's still very unnerving to me, what I saw and what we used to hear. And you look at those thick, dense, wooded areas that are laden with water moccasins and rattlesnakes and alligators and all kinds of creepy things back there, where people just don't go. I guess it would be, like I said, my grandparents and my uncle and dad would go back there hunting, but they were always in, big boots and shotguns and handguns with them. So if anything intelligent was out there, it was going to get the hell out of the way. But I could see in those kind of environments, it would be pretty easy for something to stay hidden if it didn't want to be seen.
And again, those are the kinds of stories where it's like, clearly you saw something and it was not something that you recognized. And, you know, I just like I have struggled with this. I have gone back and forth, and I also look back at all the old Native American and First Nations legends about Bigfoot, and there not only are encounters that are stories that are passed down, but it's also been a part of Native American legend and lore for centuries, and it's in a lot of different tribal stories. So I think that there's something about those as well, that this is a creature that continues to pop up in stories and in people's lives over the course of long periods of time. And I guess maybe that's part of one of the things that I thought about is maybe Bigfoot doesn't exist anymore, but maybe it did. Maybe it was around and very much part of the ecosystem and the landscape. And it's just, its environment has been so degraded that it couldn't survive. But I certainly, you could envision the possibility of it having been here in previous time.
And I can tell you, Laura, having just come back from a casino, Indian property, doing an event, I was talking to some of the elders and some of the people at the bar. Mm. And one gentleman started to get real loose-lipped with me and was talking. As a matter of fact, they shut him down quick as he started to talk about skinwalkers and Bigfoot.
Okay.
And they all surround him quick. They're like, hey, is this something you want to talk about right now? Is this something you want to let him in on? And he was like, yeah, let's talk. And they're like, I don't know. If you want to talk about this tomorrow after you're sober, you can talk to him about it. But, this is stuff that maybe is best just kept for us. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, is this cultural? You can't, it's Bigfoot, it's skinwalkers. That's all I'm asking about. And, they were very polite and were not condescending to me. But I also got that vibe. This is stuff you don't need to know. This is our culture. This is our belief system. And that was another one of those moments in my head that sprung up like, there's something very real about this that is not just imagination. Because again, I'm sitting at a bar drinking with a very nice old man who's throwing down and could have just been telling us some tall tale, some Indian folklore. And they shut him down fast and furious and did not want him to continue on because of the ramifications, as they kind of put it. That made it really even more intriguing to me.
Yeah. And, I heard a story through my parents, this is one of those sort of chain down the line stories, but it was a friend of my dad's. He did a lot of wildlife conservation stuff, and he happened to be up in Canada with a colleague of his. And this colleague had been up in like the hinterlands somewhere and in one of the tribal areas, and had been talking to members of the tribe and saw a photo album out on the table and started flipping through it. And there was, all the photos you would expect to see of all different kinds of wildlife. And then there was something he didn't recognize. And he said, well, what's that? And the woman who he was talking to was just very matter of fact. She said, oh, that's Sasquatch. And it was a deer, like it was something they saw all the time. And so I tried to track him down and was unable to do so because he was fair number of people removed from me as far as knowing him. But those kinds of stories really they stand out.
Yeah, they certainly do. And it again, it's one of those points that when you start to think it's just too fantastic to be real, suddenly you're kind of shaken awake again, if that's a good term to use. You're knocked back into the possibilities of this. We have 7 minutes left to go here. What do you in re-examining these type of stories in these cases, in the advent of all the programming that's out there regarding creatures and cryptids and monsters, what do you really hope to kind of bring to the audience that's different?
Well, I think for one, this is kind of aimed a little bit less at the hardcore Bigfoot people, because I think a lot of what I'm talking about in it, they're going to be like, oh yeah, we know that. Come on, lady. Tell us something new. So I like to think of this as Bigfoot 101 for perhaps the uninitiated, and maybe it's the kind of thing that'll get them interested and make them think about it a little bit more, maybe be a little bit more open-minded to the idea of it. That's one of the ways I wanted to do this story. The other thing is it's just the family connection. There's not a lot of people who get to say that they are related to someone who was as prominent in the Bigfoot community as Grover was. And, you know, he was like Bigfoot royalty. So to be able to sort of trot that out, you know, I would go to symposiums and I'd go to lectures and I'd go to meetings and stuff, and they'd make you wear your name tag. And of course, I had my last name on it, and people would recognize that, and they'd say, "Oh, are you related to Grover?" Which was always kind of fun to explain the family connection. I'm just sorry I never got the opportunity to meet him because he sounds like he was quite a guy. But just bringing in that family connection to it too. But the other thing I like to do is I like to play is I'm introducing some of the interesting science that I learned about that isn't even necessarily tied in with Bigfoot. But for instance, this week's episode was all about DNA and the fact that DNA analysis has gotten so powerful and the tools they have are so fine-tuned that they can actually figure out what species are without even having a body, which that could mean a lot for the world of Bigfoot. If you can get a sample that has some sort of unknown DNA signature in it, especially unknown primate, that could be an indication that something like Bigfoot's out there.
There has been a lot of independent studies done, and hair samples, skin samples, blood samples sent in for examination. Has anything come back intriguing that you've come across?
Not to my knowledge. The guy that I spent the most time talking to was a fellow by the name of Todd Disotell, who is a molecular primatologist at New York University. And he is of the mindset that the odds that Bigfoot is out there are adjacent to zero just because of the lack of physical evidence. But he is extremely fascinated by the idea. And he says, you know, if it is out there, I've got the tools to help identify it. And he will work with certain vetted, specific researchers, people like Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University, who's an anthropologist there, and another kind of followed in the footsteps of Grover in terms of academia and bringing Bigfoot into that world. And he'll work with him, and he'll work with a few others, and as they bring samples in, he'll and they raise the money for it, he'll run tests on them to see what they can find.
There is kind of a preponderance of this circumstantial evidence of these creatures, right? And talking to anthropologists, talking to science, do they have any explanation for how something like this could survive without being detected for so long? I mean, it's real easy to dismiss and say it can't because we haven't detected them and found them and we haven't found their bodies. But has science given us a reason why we shouldn't?
I think, at least talking to Dr. Meldrum, the feeling was that any area of the country that could sustain a bear population could ostensibly sustain a Bigfoot population in terms of cover, in terms of food and resources available. It really depends on who you're talking to. There's a sort of wide variety of opinions. I also started hearing opinions about how Bigfoot can move through dimensions, and then that became a little bit harder to swallow, at least for me. I know that is a theory that's out there and one that a lot of people subscribe to, but that was a harder one for me to wrap my head around. But, in terms of, even though we don't have the physical evidence, and then there's all this circumstantial evidence, Grover made the argument that there's thousands of footprints that have been found. And there's no way that one person could be faking all of them. So if your two options are someone is faking all these footprints, or there's like a secret society of footprint fakers out there that is extremely secretive and has never spilled the beans, or there's Bigfoot, his feeling was that Bigfoot was the more probable of the two.
It does tend to lean towards that, doesn't it? And are you still hopeful that in your journey you'll find something, or is it just more about not necessarily the destination, but the people you meet along the way?
It's a little of both. I mean, it would be amazing if some sort of proof positive of Bigfoot's existence came up during the process of this. I mean, that would be fantastic. But, you know, I'm a total neophyte at this, and people have been doing this for decades and have not come up with that kind of evidence, that kind of proof that seems to be required. So for me, it is also about the journey. It's the meeting these people, getting a chance to talk to them, to sort of see this subculture of American society, to learn about something that has a lot of cultural appeal to Americans. Even if you don't believe in Bigfoot, people are fascinated by the idea of it. I have yet to have, I've only had one conversation with someone who wasn't interested, and that was my accountant, and I'm okay with that because I'd rather she just deal with my taxes.
That's right.
But most people are really fascinated by this, and they have a lot of questions, and they want to know more, and it's fun for them.
Thank God. That's how you and I are going to stay on and continue to do what we love to do. Laura Krantz, the podcast is called wildthingpodcast.com. We've got a link up to that on her banner tonight. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun.